Welcome to Leominster Access Television and Neighborhood Snapshot. My name is Bob Saudelli. I am a member of the Leominster Historical Commission. Our program today focuses on a section of Leominster well known to many people in Leominster, both because it was and is a residential neighborhood where people grew up, lived, and still live, and it was the site of one of the city's industrial giants, the Viscoloid company, Dupont Nemours Company. Our guests today are Mr. Gene Koresha, Mr. Emil Brosso, and Mr. M. Donald Pimerini. Gene will be familiar to many of you folks in the LATV audience because he is a master musician, a professional trumpeter of wonder. I saw the Alley Pier quartet perform and I was amazed. So Gene is familiar to many of you folks. Emil, Mr. Brosso, is familiar to many of you folks because he was on a previous interview with Carl Pimerini, his nephew, and is very familiar to the folks in Leominster, and he's very active still at his age. He's young at heart, he's active, even though he has hindered a little bit by an injury recently. He managed to get here on this cold day, and he's familiar because of his volunteer work at Sholin Farms and other activities. And Don Pimerini is familiar to many people in Leominster because not only is he a lifelong resident of Leominster, as these gentlemen are. Emil, were you born in Leominster too? Yeah, 1914, so lifelong resident of Leominster, and Don is also familiar through his years of teaching in Lunenburg and his work as chairman of the Leominster Historical Commission. We're going to begin by setting, as we try to always do for the people new to Leominster and for the lifelong residents of Leominster, the era of this particular section of Leominster, the time and the place. Let's start with the place. And I'm very briefly going to try to focus in for the new folks in Leominster. If you came to Leominster today and you had no idea of where we were talking about, if you know where Lancaster Street is, if you know where Mike's Super Shell station is, if you know where the Gondola restaurant is, then right opposite Mike's Super Shell, at the intersection at the corner of Lancaster Street and Elm Hill Avenue, there's one of the few remaining buildings, Building 100, of a once immense industrial complex, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but it was an immense place. But that's where we're talking about for the Viscoloid company and for Dupont, but we're going to focus on that whole neighborhood, which Don will maybe highlight and orient for us a little later. And the era covers, the time in history covers from about 1901 through to the 1970s. And my role in this interview is going to be just as a facilitator, and I am going to pretty much keep quiet. I would like to get these gentlemen just talking because in the anteroom before they started to, when we were talking about how this was going to go, they started chit-chatting, and here before the cameras started rolling, they have fascinating stories which are much more interesting than what I have to say. So we're going to begin by having Don tell you something about the history and foundation of the Viscoloid company.
Thank you, Bob. Well, to begin with, I had to accumulate as much data as I could, even though I grew up there for the first 10 years of my life. I still had to review some of the things that happened before my time. And what I did is I did some research, and I came across Bernard Doyle's book on the history of comb making in America, and I want the camera person to identify the book that I'm quoting from, so there's no misunderstanding, okay, that a lot of my material has come from this book. Thank you. Now, the area in question we're talking about, I'm going to point to this on the map, is this area right in here, okay? And it goes quite a distance up from that point. And I'd like to, if it's all right with you, Bob, just to give you an idea of the area. It includes all of Lancaster Street, Elm Hill Avenue, Dudley Street, Longwood Avenue, Viscoloid Avenue, Howard Street, am I correct so far,
right.
Gene? Okay, Litchfield Street, though there weren't very many homes on Litchfield Street, Fallbrook Avenue,
Right.
where Percy Johnson grew up there, Melbourne,
Right.
Lakeview, Crescent Knoll, and Nobile Place. There are some other areas too, but I'm not going to get into those. But I'm sure each of you is familiar with those areas.
And
Now,
Percy Johnson, by the way, for people who don't recognize that name, was a photographer, an early photographer in Leominster, and made many of glass slides, which the LATV studios have scanned. So that's that reference.
thank you.
You're welcome.
When I read the book here on comb making in America, and it was printed by Bernard Doyle, I started to make analogies of what the Viscoloid Dupont area was at the turn of the century. And the only thing I could equate it to, or an analogy, is Silicon Valley that's taking place in California. In other words, the plastic industry started in our little town of Leominster about 1901. And it went for about 40 years, and then, of course, it went downhill drastically. But at that time in history, it was very important for the residents of Leominster, because many of them made their livelihood at the Viscoloid Dupont factories. As Emil will point out to you later on, illustrating the size of this complex, and Bob has already pointed it out to you. But in order for me to give you some background, I think I should read it. I think it would be clearer in the long run if this is historical information as well as neighborhood information. First of all, I'd like to refer to the area, Gene, if it's all right with you, as the Viscoloid Dupont neighborhood area, or the Dupont Viscoloid area, because we have not identified it as a neighborhood as yet. I think it's time we did.
Even though there isn't a sign.
No, we
one.
never mentioned it as a neighborhood, but I think it's time we did. Bernard W. Doyle was born in Leominster October 29th, 1873, was active in the horn industry in Leominster for many years. In 1897, he became manager of the horn supply company on the corner of Graham Street and Central. The company supplied horns to many of the small comb button manufacturers in Leominster. Doyle acquired a broad knowledge of horns and traveled domestically and internationally for the company in the interest of horn. By 1898, because of the steady decrease in supply and related increase in price, making the finished horn products more expensive, Doyle realizes this fact and the growing popularity of a new plastic known as celluloid. And it was becoming a substitute for horn. And he convinced 3 other businessmen to join him in founding a new company solely for the manufacture of this novel plastic material. Thus, Doyle, together with Alexander S. Patton of Leominster, Ludwig Strauss of New York, and Paul Rye of Paris, founded the Viscoloid Company in 1901. In 1900, both France and Germany were well advanced in the manufacturing and the fabrication of celluloid, and already had established foreign and domestic markets for celluloid products. To get the new plant up and running without delay, the company imported 2 German chemists, and I think perhaps you know the name of them, the 2 German chemists. Well, I'm sure we'll think of the name eventually. And they were the expertise in the fabrication of celluloid because they had the knowledge of the dye industry, D-Y-E. The dye industry, that was a very difficult concept in America at that time in history. But the Europeans were excellent in the use of dyes. Supported by this competent technical staff, the company quickly became operational and expanded rapidly and became a very successful manufacturing plastic company. And the compound was known as peroxaloid, but they changed the name to celluloid. It came in sheets, and they could duplicate tortoiseshell, ivory, amber, and many other natural products. And of course, as Emil will point out to you, they made toys, brushes, hand mirrors, toilet articles, and many other materials. At the same time, because of the manufacturing of these products, they needed help. So the best thing was to import help from Europe. Not only did they import the Germans, but they also found that the Italians were available, and they came in abundance, and the work was good, and many of them from Europe came to the Leominster area. I think that's about it for the history.
Thank you, Don. I have a question, and I know the answer to this question, but there may be some very young people in Leominster who don't. You said, you talked about horn. They made stuff out of horn. Now, I know Gene plays a horn, and what is this horn that you're talking about? And you said horn supply, and what connection does that have to plastics?
Well, maybe someone else can explain that. I can explain it, but maybe Emil perhaps knows more information than I.
Well, on the horn, they used to get them from Texas, the longhorn cattle. And
animal horns?
Animal horns.
Okay.
And they brought them up here, and they used to soak them in a brine, and then they'd flatten them out, and then they'd cut the comb from that. So and that's how it started.
The combs and the buttons and so on were made before plastic had been invented.
Before plastic, that's right.
Out of animal horn.
Yeah. They had a place on Exchange Street also where they did this work. Also a small place up in the Exchange Street.
And for the people brand new to Leominster, if you go down to Central Street at the intersection of Central and Graham, where there's a brand new CVS, that used to be the Horn
Supply
and Supply Company.
That's right.
And there were actual animal horns brought in there, and I grew up in that area, and it had an aroma in the summertime that was unmistakable.
With all the leftovers of the horn, they made fertilizer.
Right, it was made
to be fertilizer.
So, okay, so I just wanted to clarify that for the audience, the animal horn, the precursor of the plastics industry.
Well, I'm at an age now where I suppose that people understand my terminology. I didn't realize that they wouldn't understand what...
Well, but remember, there are many people brand new to Leominster, and the kids don't know about this stuff, many of them.
In fact, prior to the Viscoloid, Emil will verify this, tortoiseshell and horn industry was rather extensive in Leominster, and they made some very fine products, and it originated on the Hill families on Pleasant Street. That was the beginning of the horn industry, and these people did come from Newbury, Mass, and they came from Scotland, and they brought that industry with them. And an extension of that industry, of course, is the manufacturing of plastics. So it was a natural progression of that type of industry, from horn to celluloid, and then later, Emil, you're going to talk about lucite and nylon and all the newer products that they're making today.
Right.
Now, Emil, this is sort of move smoothly to what Don is just talking about, the products. I look at that picture and it looks to me like it's a huge complex. And could you just point out where the Building 100, which still exists today? I think it's called the Gateway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Boucher owns that.
But that's, so people new to the town, or to the city, that building is still there, and there may even be 100 on it. But would you tell us something? It's a giant complex.
Yes, it is. It's a three-story building, a very large building, and we consolidated in there about 1940 sometime.
Well, how many buildings, why is it called 100? How many buildings were there in there?
104 buildings actually in this complex.
104 buildings?
104 buildings, yes.
How many people working there at its height?
In 1929, there was 3,000 people working there.
3,000 people
Yes.
employed in that complex.
Right. And then we moved all the rest of the buildings into this one here. And this over here is Building 101, where they made the toothbrushes and and the toys, small toys, in this area. The office building was right in here, where they done the hiring and all that. Hospital was right behind that. We had a hospital, an experimental building right in there, right in this area.
I think it should be noted, it was a pretty well self-contained
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah.
They even had their own fire department,
Yeah,
so to
right.
speak. They had sheds that, I remember this as a kid, they had sheds that were scattered all over the complex that housed the hoses and the fire hydrants, and they used to have periodic drills, which my brother used to take part in because he worked right across the street from the old family homestead. And they would have these drills and practice pulling the hoses out and doing all that sort of thing in case of because that material they were using in those days was very flammable. It would go up quickly. It didn't take much.
Yesterday at the Historical Commission office, I was talking to our historian, Sherwin Drury, and a little anecdote that I wanted to get in about that. He grew up in North Leominster section of Leominster, and the fire department used to have a different system of calls. When they blast the horn, and they still blast the fire horn, the siren today, not on the trucks, but on the fire station. But I think you fellas remember, and I do remember, even on the calendars, there'd be so many blasts on the horn would indicate there was a certain section of town.
Right.
And I think today that when you hear the fire horn blast go off, I think it's calling, I'm not sure, but I think it's calling different groups of firefighters today. But in those days, Sherwin said that there used to be, the horn used to go off so often for Dupont that it was 7 blasts and then 2 blasts. 7 blasts and then 2 blasts. And the people used to say, oh, it's just another Dupont fire. It happened so frequently. And Emil, I think you said that, didn't they even construct the building so when there was an explosion?
Yes, and also the roof, where one of the buildings blew up one time, 66 building, and blew, and the roof went up in the air and spun around 2 or 3 times and came down. One man was killed in that one there, Martel. His name was Martel. He was outside of a tank. The other man was inside of the tank. But the man inside the tank was okay because he was inside of there. But he was blown out of there.
And did those explosions and fires happen frequently?
Yes, very much
Frequently.
so. I was blown across the room 16 feet by an explosion in number 9. One of the big fire doors was partially open, and it blew the fire door out, and I went out 16 feet off there.
Wow. But those buildings were specifically constructed for the roof to go.
Well, yes, they make them weaker so that so they would go.
And were you, I remember speaking to someone, the Dupont plant eventually was it New Jersey?
New Jersey.
And you had done some consultation work down there.
That's right.
And they were constructed a little differently so that
Along the river where they built all the buildings, the rear wall was weaker
Jersey.
than the rest. In New Jersey.
Yeah.
And if they had an explosion, the wall would go down and the rest of the building would stay up, so that the whole building would go down.
So in New Jersey, so it was
right.
differently.
Right.
I can give a little history about the manufacturing of celluloid. Celluloid was first originated in Switzerland, and that was in the 1860s. And then, of course, France and Germany picked it up, and they made it for a long time. And they made it primarily for billiard balls, because billiard balls at one time were made out of ivory, and that was rather an expensive proposition. But the thing is that simultaneously, the new gunpowder had been coming into play, and we were using black powder at that time in history. Well, they had a new material made out of cotton, and it was called gun cotton. And gun cotton is actually nitrocellulose, nitrogen, configurations of nitrogen with nitrates with cellulose. And if you put it with camphor, and of course Rima will explain this, then you end up with varieties of peroxylin or celluloid. And of course, if you're talking about gun cotton, you're talking about an explosive item. And that's why Gene said that the buildings burned and the men had to learn how to put these fires out.
Yeah. We had a camphor still. We had a camphor still there, and we had building 66 where the gun cotton was there, and they used to grind the gun cotton. And that's why we had a lot of different explosions, because of the gun cotton there.
And of course, Gene lived close by. You said you lived in one
Right across the street.
Well, point to it, Gene.
There's a family house right there. He's got right on it.
Right there?
Yep.
So you're very
Come down
familiar
a
with
little bit. Come down. That one right there.
That one right here.
So that was right across from the entrance to the Doyle Works.
Almost.
No, not quite. Just a little further
The entrance
down.
was further
The
up.
main entrance was right across from what is now the Twins Cafe.
Yeah, right.
And the KFC. That's where the main entrance was originally. And it was quite an entrance. It had pillars with lights on it, security guards. You couldn't get through there without a pass.
Security guards?
No,
Well, they had
That's
their
news
own,
to me.
Yeah, they had their own system.
we had, you know,
And were they allowed to smoke cigarettes in there?
no.
Not inside, no. That
You'd leave,
was-
you'd leave your matches at the gatehouse before you enter in there. You couldn't go in there with matches or any kind of a lighter.
That gate was always closed.
Yeah.
You had to get cleared before you could enter that complex.
You had to show your pass, actually.
Gene, when we look through our old photographs, we find that there are street railroad tracks that go down Lancaster Street.
Yeah, that was the old trolley car
The old
system.
trolley, yeah.
So that was the transportation then, Ema, for you to get to work, or was it a bus?
No, I walked to work because I was not too far away, so I lived on Howard Street. So,
Howard, you didn't mention that.
Yeah,
You lived
I
on
live right on
Yeah, you
Howard
lived right-
Street. Let's see. That
Is your house there?
Where is it? No, my house, that's Howard Street.
You can't see it from
Yeah,
this
but I'm further down in this area.
I see.
I'm on the last house, and then
His was the last house before Portland Street,
Portland
which turns
Street,
the
right.
corner.
Right.
That's when Howard Street was a dead end. It only went as far as that, where his house was.
Yeah.
Well, on Howard Street, there were a lot of different people that lived there. I came across a list. Maybe you can recall some of them.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Emil, here I have the Sabatellis live there.
Yeah.
Bacchus lived there.
The Pirros, the Cosenzas, the Diggins, the La Pasta.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And then on Dudley Street, I came across Martino,
Right,
Yep.
Patrica,
right.
yeah, Koresha, of course,
Yeah.
Gerard, Cimento,
Right.
DePace, and Goglione.
Right.
Yeah,
And then on Longwood Avenue, which was right next to there, I came across Naki,
right.
That's right.
Greco,
Greco,
Martino, Antonioni,
right.
Yep.
Ciccone, Farinelli,
Right.
Navaroli, Mezzafaro, Palermo, and then on Elm Hill Avenue, and I think we mentioned these before, Gene, Massoni,
That's right.
Joe
Casasa,
Mazzoni, yeah.
Bisceglia,
Yep.
Caranzani, Donato, Griffa,
Right,
That's right, Mr. Griffer.
Lanciani,
yeah,
De Carolis, Moroni,
right.
Yep.
Membrino, Kalin, and Piermarini. And on Lancaster Street, there was the Lally family, the Piermarini family, Scipione, Proietti, Marini, and I'm talking about this area just,
That's right,
just west of this area, and the Somas, the Consalvos,
Right.
the Seswicks.
Yeah.
Now, you would have known the Seswicks,
Oh, yeah,
and the
yeah.
Somas,
They were on
family,
Lancaster Street.
the Amachus,
Yeah, Mrs.
and Frida, and Guerra, and Piano, and Camadella, Amico,
Amico,
Caligaris, the Lanons, Koresha, of course, again. They were, the point I'm trying to make here, Gene, is when Doyle started his factory with his partners, they brought a lot of Italians over. Did you notice the names I read?
Yeah.
That's right.
There weren't too
And-
many Murphys and O'Reillys in there, I did notice.
Well, I left out Emil's name because the people that came in to work at the Viscoloid, they came from all over town.
That's right.
They came
Right.
from French Hill.
Right.
And that's why I asked about the transportation. You were able to walk, but they
Right.
also had to have bus.
Oh,
or
yes.
Somehow they had to
They
get
had buses regularly coming down to the factory to bring in the workers in the morning and picking them up at night.
there. Yes, but prior to the buses, they must have had a trolley system.
They had a trolley system one time there.
And then they had to come from Lincoln Terrace, I'm talking about neighborhoods
Right,
now.
right.
They had to come from the Plains,
Right,
right, French Hill.
right. French Hill, a
So
lot
they
of
had,
people.
they came from all different areas
Yeah.
in order to have 3,000 people working in there.
right.
They must have come from all over town.
Some came from Fitchburg and also from
Fitchburg
here.
also.
Right.
Well, before the automobile took over and the, the buses as we know it, there was a real expansive trolley system throughout the state and through the country. You could take trolleys from one city to the next. You'd have to interchange, And before they were self-propelled, I think they were horse-drawn. Long before our time, they had horse-drawn trolleys. And you could go, I remember being on a trolley with my father. I was maybe 5 years old, 6 years old, going to Fitchburg. They used to go to Clinton. You could take the trolley to Worcester. And they all went right down Lancaster Street, right in front of my house is where the trolley track, the tracks were still there when I was a kid. I could see those tracks.
And the trolley stop, down by former Leominster Lake.
That's right.
That
Right.
was the trolley.
Right on the other side of where the old
The car
Italian
barn was
center
right near
The car
there.
barn
Yeah.
was
Car
right in
barn was
there.
right
Yeah.
in there.
That's old Lancaster Road.
Yes.
You just mentioned another neighborhood. You call it a car barn.
They
Yeah.
called it the car
Car
barn in
barn,
those
that's what they
days.
called
you
it.
know that?
There was another car,
Yeah.
different from the car
Yeah.
barn
Yeah.
in
In
that we
Fitchburg.
know
The one in
of as
Fitchburg.
Fitchburg, yes.
Yeah.
Because that was another trolley company.
Right.
That's right.
And they're two separate
When
trolley
the trolleys went out, there was a company called the Level Bus Line
That's right.
that used to travel 117 Lancaster Street all the way down to Maynard, I believe it was. they had a barn in Mainen, and they used to house their buses right in the old car barn in Leominster that we were just talking about, right off of the old Lancaster Road.
And the F&L trolley company and street railway company eventually, railway company, had Whalum Park as its sort of area to get people to use the trolleys. And that succeeded. Whalum Park succeeded, whereas the Leominster Lake, the Clinton Railway, or Worcester Consolidated, then changed its name, that flopped. And we did another neighborhood snapshot of the Leominster Lake area, which is no longer there.
Yeah, it's gone.
But that trolley, that amusement area.
That was a park right behind the St. Cecilia's cemetery.
Yes, and there was a dam down behind the
further.
former Italian-American club and the lake. But that flopped, that failed because of the stench of the Nashua River eventually. But that would have given competition to Whalum, but Whalum succeeded, Whalum Park, and Leominster Lake failed.
Yeah, I used to.
Memory.
Now, Emo talked about walking to work, and Viscoloid Avenue used to go all the way through, as it does now, to Mechanic Street, but it was a dirt road.
Yeah, it was built in
And you
1926.
could, yeah, it was a dirt road. You could walk that.
You could walk, yeah.
You could. I remember the Leominster, the Eagles Drum and Bugle Corps used to practice up there when I was a little kid.
Yeah, Dupont actually paid for that
That's
road.
right.
I'd like to get back to
Okay.
the Viscoloid, and then we'll continue
Yeah.
on, right? When I read the names from the neighborhood, there were a lot of Italian names in there.
A lot of Italian people.
And so I'd like to just bring a personal note on this, if it's all right with you folks. I was born here on Elm Hill Avenue. My dad, Gasparino Piermarini, built this house right here on Elm Hill Avenue, and he was related. His wife was a Casassa, so you can see that the families got together. They were all from Italy, and they got together even though they were from different sections of Italy. For instance, my dad was from a little town called Piratare, which is in the central section of Italy, north of Rome. And he had a buddy by the name of Clito Piermarini, and they both came to this country in 1913. And eventually, Clito, of course, went into the construction business, but my dad stayed with the Viscoloid. He started early with the Viscoloid, and he had two friends, and I'm going to name those two color chemists, by the way, that I mentioned earlier, Emil. One was named Schultes, John Schultes, and the other was Paul Schultes.
Yeah, both German people.
Yes, they were the two color chemists.
Yeah.
And there was another one, Fritz Schneider.
Yeah, that one I knew.
You knew him. So
Yes, I did.
you see, Emil knows these people. I just knew of them when I was a little kid. They would come to the house, so I knew of them.
Yeah, right.
Well, the reason I knew of them is because they took my dad on as an apprentice. And this would have been 1914, 1915, something like
right.
that. Now that is prior to the First World War.
Right.
You realize that.
Right.
And then, of course, during the First World War, he worked there, and then he continued on until 1938, 1939. But during that time, he became an excellent color chemist, and then eventually he worked for the place down in New Jersey, Delaware. Then he went to Monsanto.
That's right.
Okay, but then Gasparino eventually, Gene would know him as Gus. He was the superintendent of the Standard Peroxide, another celluloid manufacturing company in Leominster. But I am just giving you one little incident that happened here at this big complex, because many people came out of that complex of all different nationalities, and they started their own factories, right?
Right.
You know some of them.
Well, his brother did, Larry, yeah.
Yes, Larry.
Well, my brother Larry worked at Dupont's, and the last place he was in was right across the street from the house where Union Products has that building now. And they had a collar department there. Used to make detachable collars. And a gentleman by the name of C.E. Buckley, Connie Buckley, bought that company when Dupont was downsizing, and my brother made the decision to go with him. And that was back around 1939. And he stayed with them right up until he was still working when he was in his around 81, 82 years old. We had to talk him into retiring. And I used to work there part-time with Mr. Buckley's son. After high school, we'd go there and work for a few hours. And we learned to make those collars, and we'd ship them all over the world. Back in those days, people were still wearing them, you know, detachable collars.
And they were made out of celluloid.
Yes,
They were
yeah.
made out of a product, a later product, I can't remember the
Acetate?
name. Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Well, Emil would know that. He would know all
probably.
those new...
Yeah, right. Well, at first they were making them out of celluloid, and then they changed over. It went to, I believe it's acetate.
It became a safer product in
Yeah.
later years.
Yeah.
And then, I think they still make them today at the C. Buckley
Yes,
Company.
yeah, they do.
Buckley's religious article store is
Mostly
still,
religious,
they're
right.
still in business,
Yeah.
and I think they do still make
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
collars
For the priests, the nuns,
Yeah.
ministers.
And the cuffs, and the
And the
cuffs.
cuffs
too.
too.
And
Well, those are just two incidences, right? And of course, you could expand that multifold of the numbers of people that grew
a
out
lot
of
of
this
people work there.
complex.
yeah. Well, you mentioned the Sabatellis. Well, she
Yes.
was related to me through marriage. His wife was my first cousin. Her mother and my mother were sisters. And her father and even Mike Sabatelli, I believe, worked at Dupont's
Yeah.
before he
Oh,
ever...
many of them.
Yeah.
Before he started his jewelry business years ago, which later expanded into quite a business.
That was more of a family business in the sense that one would get in and then the rest of the family would follow, and there'd be families, a lot of different families, the Chacconis and all of them there, all in there.
And another interesting factor was that a lot of these people you mentioned, a lot of them knew each other. So these Italian people, especially, they came from. Some of them came from the same area in Italy. I guess that's how they got to know about this
Yeah.
place.
I think the word got back,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there was an opportunity here, and
Exactly.
you could earn a living
Yeah.
and own property.
Yeah.
And that was a big thing, especially for the little towns in central and northern Italy.
I know my mother worked there for many years, and my sister did also.
She worked
Emil
there.
worked with my sister.
Well,
Yeah,
simultaneously, the same thing was happening among the French population in Canada.
Sure.
Yeah,
They
right.
come south
That's right.
too.
That's right.
And many of them work.
No,
I
yeah.
know Dick Elaine's father worked there.
Yeah,
Ernie.
yeah.
Ernie,
Ernie Elaine.
Sure,
Ernest Elaine, yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
He worked there. He
He worked,
spent,
in fact, he worked for me for quite some time. He was a mechanic, changing molds and all that. Yeah.
and of course, when you talk about a mole, that's a M-O-L-D,
D.
the thing is, you're talking about die makers.
Well, yes.
That's
die
right,
makers.
yeah.
The die makers had to
Exactly.
make the molds so we could place them in the machine and mold them
So
from
that was
any
another
plastic
industry
you
that-
wanted to work. Yeah.
That was another industry that came out of the Viscoloid,
Yes.
the die makers, because now the molding machines
That's
came
right.
into being.
That's right.
Now, I understand from talking to you, Emil, that you were one of the first to use a molding machine?
Well, on the, they call it a Zegler, and Foster & Grant's had one, and Dupont had one. And it's in the Historical Society on Lancaster Street. One is there. I operated the same machine as that. It's not that machine, but the same make of machine. And I made the first plastic shotgun shell in the world. It was made out of plastic seal.
The first plastic shotgun
shell.
ever made
Yeah.
in the world.
I made it.
You made it.
Yeah, and it was made on a hand. That was a hand machine. You had to close the mold by hand, then pull in that lever, and the puncher would go in and fill the mold, and then you had to reverse it and unlock it, and take it out of the mold.
Emil, where was the machine made?
That was made in Germany.
And approximately what year was this thing?
Well, when I operated it was in probably 1935, 34.
Emil will verify this. One of the problems they had in those days with those molding machines They were very tricky and dangerous. Quite a few men lost their hands or got hurt very badly.
Until we put the safety bars on. Dupont was the first one to put safety bars on. When the mold would open, a bar would drop down, and it would lock that mold so that it wouldn't close.
Today, there are governmental regulations, OSHA and so on, but in those days, Gene, right, there were no,
I don't think so. No.
there weren't the
was no-
regulations.
yeah.
And I remember when it was DuPont's, my dad worked there, and Commonwealth Plastics, and then at DuPont's as a machinist, very, very skilled. And they used to pride themselves, DuPont used to pride themselves on their safety record. They, I remember the sign at the
That's
entrance.
right.
Right at the entrance.
Was operated
That's right.
so many
Yeah.
So many days without a lost time accident.
Right, they were
Exactly
very,
right.
very strict on that,
Right.
necessarily so.
Right.
Looking at this fantastic picture, by the way, to give credit where credit is due, this is one of Arthur Bedoin's
a great
aerial
picture.
photographs.
Beautiful.
Taken. He was a pioneer aerial photographer and also the owner of Airport Sales, and the
little
Historical Commission has his collection of fabulous aerial photos of the region, and LATV has been scanning those and restoring those. But this is, I know I may hear about this, and I want to say, talking about anecdotes, in that picture, and Emil, you may have been in one of those buildings when this incident happened, I'm not sure, but there was a little kid named Muzio Donald Pimerini, and he was with his pals in the winter, and there's I'm going to have
Want me to
Don-
tell the story?
I want you to tell the story. Show where it happened first, because I hear this.
Emil, this would have occurred maybe 1935, 36, somewhere around in there. I was probably in the first or second grade, okay? And what I'll do is I'll point to it, okay?
The pond?
No, the thing is, remember, I was born here.
Right.
On 15 Elm Hill Avenue. That's where my dad had built a house.
Right.
Well, down here, the Somers had a...
They were on Lancaster Street, yeah.
Does this thing work?
Yeah,
Yes,
it does.
you're
You got to point it right to it.
See the red?
Oh, there it is. There it is. The Somers had a home over here.
Yeah,
One
right.
of the Somers, there was a large family of
Tony,
Somers.
you're probably talking about
And
Tony.
one of the oldest one was Tony.
Tony.
Tony
yeah.
Somers.
Yeah.
You probably remember Tony.
Oh, very
Well,
much so.
there is a railroad track. You see that railroad
Yeah,
track? The
you're
railroad
right,
track goes
right.
over like this.
Right behind.
And then, and can you see the railroad track has a little section that goes right into the Viscoloid plant. I'm gonna
Yeah,
use
it
this.
does. It goes
See
right behind
in
it.
here?
It goes right behind it.
Yes. Well, right down in here, there are two ponds.
That's right.
And those two ponds we referred to as the Viscoloid ponds.
Right.
For want of terminology.
Right.
Well, the story that Bob wants me to tell is these ponds, one used to freeze over in the wintertime. The other one didn't. And I could never figure why it never froze
The
over.
acid.
What?
The acid going into the pond.
I don't know.
Yeah, I believe
you
so.
tell me why it didn't
Yeah.
freeze over. You worked there.
Yeah.
Well, we used to skate on that pond.
That's
when we were
right.
kids,
Right.
Because that's Fall Brook. Fall
Right.
Brook goes right through
Right.
these two ponds. Well, I'm on the pond skating, and the boys are playing hockey. My older brother, Danny, maybe Gene was there, I don't know.
Could be.
They were playing out there, and well, I wanted to go home. I had enough. And I was reading a comic book, and as Fall Brook comes in, there's no ice. So I went right under the water. Well, when I came up, the guys were on their bellies with their hockey sticks, and Tony Sommer reaches over and he grabs me by the shirt collar and flips me right out onto the ice. Right? I was probably, what, 6 years old, maybe 7 years old.
See, there was an acid room right up in here, and that acid would come down, and it was a yellow smoke, like it'd go right by his house.
And it smelled.
Smell, a very strong smell. And all that yellow smoke would come down right by his house, right behind it. It'd go down in
We
here.
never swam in the one that we never froze over. We only swam or skated on the one
That's
that
right.
froze.
Yeah, right.
Well, anyways, when I got out on shore, my brother, my older brother, made me run all the way home so I wouldn't freeze to death.
We used to do that. We skate there in the wintertime and
The Viscoloid
and
pond?
swim there. We'd sneak in. You weren't supposed to be there.
Oh, I know. It was all fenced in, if I
That's right.
remember
That's
correctly.
right.
We
They'd
found a
throw
way
you
to
out
get
of there if they caught you down, yes.
But we were smart enough not to go into the acid pond?
Yeah.
That's news to me. Huh?
Well, the acid flew right by that, it went right by that, and I believe some acid went into that pond, and probably that kept it from freezing, you know? I'm not sure about that, but I believe it did.
But I'll tell you, we did a lot of fishing on Fall
right.
Brook, Gene.
Yeah.
You probably fished in
No,
Fall.
I wasn't much of a fisherman, so. But
If you went down Litchfield Street, there was a little pond on the left-hand side before the electrical station.
Yeah.
That was an excellent place to go fishing. Do you remember the playground?
Oh, yeah, there was a playground right on Lancaster Street next to where the Soma home
Right,
was. There's,
Yes.
that's
Right
all
across
filled
from
in now,
Dudley
yep. Right across from the cemetery.
And we used to play ball down there.
Yeah.
Baseball. We had a baseball
Spare
diamond.
grass field,
And of course, Speargrass.
Yeah,
Speargrass is way over here.
way up in there, right,
But
Right off
the
of
ball
Marguerite
field
Avenue.
was down in here.
yeah, right,
Right, and of course, you remember the frog pond?
Yeah.
yeah,
The frog pond was right next to the railroad track.
yeah.
And
Now-
of course, for the people, why don't I point out this, Bob?
Okay.
This area right in here, Gene, do you know what this is today?
That's where the trail, isn't that a trailer
The
park?
large trailer
Yeah.
park.
Yeah, right.
And Frank Trager had a pool up in there years ago.
Oh, right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. See?
Swimming
Oh,
pool.
Verification. Isn't that great?
I have a question. Today we want, I'm sure I'm sure the supermarkets today are going to be very busy because there's an approaching snowstorm. Where did people shop in those days? Were there any local neighborhood grocery stores
Yeah.
there, or what were some of the groceries?
Right next to the Twins Cafe,
Yeah.
or what, not next to, where the Twins Cafe is today, used to be a neighborhood grocery store. The people that owned it when I was a kid were called Mr. and Mrs. Vigno.
Yeah.
Vino.
And it was a
French-
small neighborhood grocery store. You could buy products there.
Yeah.
Most of the people did their shopping on Saturdays or Thursday, because Thursday was payday.
Payday in Leominster, yes.
And then if you needed stuff, you'd go to the neighborhood grocery store. And there was another one up the street on Lancaster Street that was run by a lady
Louis
named
Marama.
Louis and C. Marama,
Yeah.
right across from Florence Street.
Yeah.
And then there were a number of them throughout the whole area, you know.
There was one across from Johnson Street.
Yes, that used to be the Gloria Food store
chain,
moved in there. It
yeah.
was up on Lincoln Terrace, and it moved down there, and eventually went uptown.
I think there were two on 6th Street.
Yeah, the
Or
different
5th
ones,
Street.
yeah.
5th Street or 6th
Neighborhood
Street.
stores.
Yeah.
What about the Friendly store? Then it became the Agricola.
Yeah.
It's where Maddie's restaurant is now. There was the
Yeah, well, that's what I was mentioning. It became, Gloria Food Chain Store was in there for a while.
at that location.
Well, that's what they called it, yeah, and then they eventually
Yeah.
moved it.
And the Benoit's also had a store on Mechanic Street, Corner Mechanic and 8. And that was a Benoit's store, that was a food store also.
So there were plenty of places for people to shop.
All over the city.
All locally.
In those days,
Every
yeah.
neighborhood.
Yeah.
Every neighborhood had a little store.
And you had mentioned, I heard Gene and Emil were talking about, and I mentioned how they're in real time now, on January 21st, 2005, the city of Leominster, and this weekend there may be a snowstorm. And so the plows will be out, the very efficient DPW will get the streets cleared and safe, but you won't see horse-drawn plows. Yet, we have people who did see
Yeah,
horse-drawn plows. So could you tell us something just as we bring our interview to a
Well,
conclusion?
they would use it to plow the sidewalks.
Sidewalks, right?
And
What, there'd be a single horse with
Yeah.
a...
Yeah. With a
Wooden
V,
plow?
V plow, a wooden plow.
It is a
wooden plow.
V-shaped plow. It would throw it off
Just
to both
separate,
sides.
just separate both sides, yeah.
And so the people could get to work.
Yeah,
So
they
the
could-
people
yeah.
get to work.
Right, so they
And I
wouldn't walk on the
remember-
road, yeah.
And I remember in a previous neighborhood snapshot, one of the interviewees had mentioned that it wasn't so important in those days because there weren't a lot of cars to get the roads plowed necessarily.
Right.
That was important, but it was mainly important to get the sidewalks because people had
Right.
to walk. To
Well, we could,
get
back
to
in
work.
those days, you could slide on the roads because there weren't too many cars out there. And there were times when we even skated on them because it got so icy.
Wow.
You could actually skate on it.
There's another point too, Gene, and that is there were some social clubs too.
Oh, a lot of
Do you
them.
remember the
Yeah.
social
Yeah.
clubs?
Oh, yeah.
in-
Forger
There was a
Club.
whole series of them up and down Lancaster Street.
Yeah.
The Forger Club, which is still there.
Saladini.
There was the Caffinio Club,
Yeah.
which is now houses a beauty shop.
Santa Maria.
The Santa Maria, which is I think that's the one, Periscope Pools,
Yeah.
is in there. Where
Romano.
Maddie's is, the building next door, there's a beauty shop there. There was a little club in there.
The Romano Club, I think.
That one I don't remember.
might have been.
There was one across the street also behind the house on the corner of Johnson and Lancaster Street. That's long gone. And
Colombo Hall down
Colombo Hall was over on 6th Street.
6th Street.
Of course,
Then-
you realize, Jeannie, my dad was Marcagiano, so they were located on the terrace,
Yeah, they had the terrace.
Lincoln Terrace. And the
Saladin.
thing is, Gene, that the clubs were associated with different areas
That's
of
right.
Italy.
That's right. Each club represented a certain area that the people
Right.
came from. The Forger
Exactly.
Club was mostly people from Forger,
Yeah.
whatever area came from. That's what they call the Marcajan
That
Club. the
doesn't exist
Bruzzese.
today.
No.
No, it does not.
No,
That's long
it's wiped
gone.
out.
Everybody has become Americanized. Yes. I don't know if it took place among the French. Did the French have very many social clubs?
You had a few, not
They had a
too
few.
many of them. Not too many of them.
The big one was St. Jean's. That was a
St.
big one.
Jean's.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, but that
Yeah.
was for everybody, all the French.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they didn't distinguish like the Italians did, whatever area you came from.
Yeah.
The other thing, Gene, is we went to this school.
Yep.
I wonder if the camera person can pick it up. This is the school in 1900. And of course, Gene and I went there in the 30s. And there was something kind of different about the school. At least I found that so when I was a kid. And that is, I went to a kindergarten.
That's right. So did I.
We had kindergartens
Yeah.
way back then in the 30s. I don't know if it took place in all the schools in town, but Lancaster Street School did.
They did have a kindergarten, right?
And not only that, but we had some unique teachers too, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
In fact, I think on the camera they may have I'm going to read a list of the teachers at the Lancaster Street School when we went there, Gene. And of course, the principal was Winifred D. Rankin. I don't know if you have a picture of her, but if you can show it, that would be great. And then there was Helen Barker. She was grade 5. Mary St. Cyr. There was a second grade 5. And then there was Madeline Murphy, grade 4. Dorothy Sullivan, a second grade 4. Beatrice Burgess, grade 3. Eileen Default, she was grade 3. Abby Scanlon,
Mrs. Scanlon.
grade 2. Margaret Murphy, grade 1. Of course, these is bringing back memories, right, Gene? And Florence Kellerley
Yep.
and Pauline Tricott, she was the kindergarten teacher, and Helen Connor. That'll just give you some idea of us going to school. And we used to go to school, Gene, if you remember, We used to walk to school.
Absolutely.
Come home for lunch, and then walk back
That's right.
again, and then it was a full day affair.
Yeah, we walked to school.
And this is a perfect spot to begin to draw our interview to a close, because Don, you're talking about school, and could I see that? Could you hold that picture up again?
It's on the screen.
It's on the screen, and it should look familiar to the viewing audience because it is the site of the present National Plastics Museum. It was formerly Lancaster Street School, and so it's kind of a nice segue or transition, because you're talking about school, and here's Lancaster Street School, and this program has focused a large part on the plastics industry, or the Viscoloid Dupont factory. So so many interesting things in history. Very, very briefly, before we conclude, is there one final quick thing you'd like to mention about Gene?
This is very interesting. You'll enjoy this. And we pointed this out earlier. Dupont had its own cafeteria. It was right on the corner where the KFC is now. And
Go ahead, Gene.
okay, and when I was a kid, I remember this. There used to be street peddlers that used to come there because it was a good spot. There were a lot of people there. They peddle their ways. The old medicine man with the snakes and the Gila monsters and all that stuff. And it was really interesting. They'd get on the corner, set up their thing, and try to sell their stuff, their medicines, Alexas, or whatever they were.
That's something a kid wouldn't forget. Well, thank you, Gene. Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Don. I want to thank the folks at the LATV studios, Kyle Pimerini, Jack Sully, Kevin Moran, Brianna Neibel, and as always, I want to thank the LATV viewing audience for tuning in to the program Neighborhood Snapshot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.